The yellow envelope trembled in Jennifer Whitman's hands as she watched her son Mason play alone in the corner of the waiting room. The diagnosis of autism, printed on Rochester General Hospital letterhead, seemed to weigh a ton. Mason, at the age of 6, lined up his cars in a perfect sequence of colors, completely absorbed in his own world. "Ms. Whitman," the receptionist's voice brought her back to reality. "Your parents have just arrived." Jennifer took a deep breath, trying to prepare herself for what was to come. Barbara and Gerald Whitman were known in Rochester for their philanthropic work and their impeccable social standing. What nobody knew was how they reacted to anything that threatened to tarnish their reputation as the perfect family. "Jenny, darling." Barbara entered the room in her characteristic Chanel and pearls ensemble, Gerald close behind in his tailored suit. "Why such an urgent meeting at Dr. Richardson's office?" Jennifer looked at Mason, who continued his meticulous ritual with the strollers, oblivious to the arrival of his grandparents. "Mom, Dad, we need to talk about Mason. We got the diagnosis today." Gerald approached the window, keeping his distance from his grandson. "Diagnosis? He seems perfectly normal to me, just a bit peculiar." "Mason has autism," Jennifer said, her voice trembling slightly. "Dr. Richardson is a specialist in child development, and after months of evaluation—" "Absurd!" Barbara interrupted, her face reddening. "This is the result of your obsession with raising the boy alone after Robert died. If you've listened to us and moved back into our house, it's nobody's fault, Mom." Jennifer tried to remain calm. "Autism is a neurological condition. Mason needs therapy, support, understanding." Gerald turned abruptly. "Understanding? And what will our friends say? The Hendersons have just enrolled their grandson at Brightwood Academy. How do we explain that our grandson can't even make eye contact?" Jennifer felt tears start to form. "He's brilliant, Dad. His teachers say his mathematical ability is extraordinary. He just processes the world differently." Barbara approached Mason, who immediately cringed at her presence. "Different doesn't survive in Rochester, Jenny. Not in our social circle." "Then maybe it's time to rethink that social circle," Jennifer replied, her voice finding strength in the need to protect her son. "Don't be naive," Gerald said, his tone sharp. "We've built a reputation in this town. We won't allow it to be destroyed by this." He gestured towards Mason, who was now rocking back and forth, disturbed by the tension in the room. Jennifer stood up, reaching for her bag. "Mason is not a dad. He's your grandson. And if you can't accept that, then perhaps it's best if we stay away." "You won't survive without our support, Jenny," Barbara warned. "Think carefully about what you're doing." "I have, Mom." "During all those months of evaluation, while you were pretending nothing was happening, I did a lot of thinking." Jennifer approached Mason, gently touching his shoulder. "Come on, darling. It's time to go home." Mason stood up methodically, stowing each trolley in his backpack with surgical precision. Barbara and Gerald watched with a mixture of horror and fascination. "This is your last chance, Jennifer," Gerald said. "Either you allow us to take control of the situation, including Mason's education and treatment, or you're on your own." Jennifer took Mason's hand, which surprisingly didn't resist her touch. "Then we're on our own." She walked towards the door, pausing only for a moment. "You know, you're so worried about what people will think about Mason being different. You don't realize that the real shame is your behavior." As Jennifer and Mason left the office, Barbara called out one last time, "You'll regret this, Jenny." In the car, Jennifer watched Mason through the rearview mirror. He had resumed playing with the cars, apparently oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. But she knew better. Mason understood everything. He just processed it in his own unique way. "It's all right, my love," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "We'll find our own way." That night, after putting Mason to bed, strictly following his routine of 3 stories, blue nightlight, and his favorite blanket positioned in exactly the same way, Jennifer allowed herself to collapse. The tears she had been holding back all day finally flowed freely. In her room, she found an old family photo, her at 16, between her parents, all smiles in front of the Whitman mansion. How had things changed so much? How could her parents, who had always preached the importance of family, so easily reject their own grandchild? But as the tears dried, a determination grew in his chest. Mason might be different, But he was extraordinary in his own way, and if his parents couldn't see that, it was their problem, not his. Jennifer didn't know it then, but that decision to protect her son at all costs would mark the beginning of a journey that would last 2 decades. A journey that would transform not only Mason's life, but also an entire family's understanding of what it really means to be normal. The auditorium at Columbia University was packed when Dr. Mason Whitman took the stage. At 26, he had become one of the brightest minds in modern neuroscience. His green eyes methodically scanned the audience as he adjusted the microphone to his exact height, not a centimeter higher or lower than he considered appropriate. The human brain, he began, his voice clear and precise, is a universe of unexplored possibilities. His hands moved in calculated patterns as he explained his latest discovery, a revolutionary treatment for neurodegenerative diseases using targeted gene therapy. In the front row, Jennifer Whitman watched her son with tears in her eyes. Mason still retained some of his characteristic mannerisms. The way he lined up his notes perfectly, the almost mathematical precision of his gestures. But now these traits were part of his world-renowned genius. After the lecture, as the audience applauded enthusiastically, a young research assistant hurried up to Mason. "Dr. Whitman, there's an urgent situation in the lab," he whispered. "It's about the Rochester case." Mason nodded, his face remaining impassive. The Rochester case was how his team referred to the experimental treatment they were developing for a specific patient in his hometown, a 75-year-old man with a rare and aggressive form of degenerative neurological disease. "Mason?" Jennifer gently touched his arm as he came down from the stage. "Did something happen?" "It's about him, Mom," Mason replied, his eyes fixed on a distant point. "The patient in Rochester. It's Grandpa Gerald." Jennifer paled. Over the last 20 years, her parents' names had rarely been mentioned. The last time she had heard from them was in a newspaper report about Gerald's retirement from the presidency of the local bank 5 years ago. "How'd you find out?" "Cross-data analysis," Mason explained, his fingers drumming rhythmically on the side of his briefcase. The medical history matched. "I ran the check 3 times to be absolutely sure." Jennifer leaned on a nearby chair. "What about the treatment? Do you think it can help him?" "The preliminary results are promising," Mason replied with his characteristic scientific objectivity. "But he'll need to come in New York for the procedure." That evening, in his Manhattan apartment, Mason organized and reorganized his notes on the case, while Jennifer prepared tea in the kitchen. The familiar ritual of lining up papers at precise angles calmed him, just as it had his childhood carts. "You don't have to do this, Mason," Jennifer said softly, placing a cup of chamomile tea, always the same temperature, next to him. "No one would judge you if you turned down the case." Mason looked up from his notes. "It would be unethical to refuse treatment to a patient who needs help, regardless of our personal history." "Your grandfather," Jennifer hesitated. "Doesn't he know that you're the doctor responsible for the research?" "No," Mason replied. "The protocol was submitted under the lab's name, not mine personally." A heavy silence filled the room. Jennifer looked at her son. The boy her own grandparents had rejected for being different was now possibly the only hope of salvation for one of them. "I received an email from the medical team in Rochester," Mason continued, his voice maintaining the same controlled cadence. "They're arranging the transfer. Grandpa Gerald arrives next week." Jennifer felt her heart squeeze. "And Grandma Barbara? She'll come with him, of course." Mason adjusted his glasses. "A chaperone will be needed during the treatment." Mason's phone vibrated. Another email about the case. As he read, Jennifer noticed how his hands trembled slightly, the only visible sign of his inner turmoil. "Do you remember that day in Dr. Richardson's office?" she asked softly. Mason nodded, still looking at his phone. "I remember every detail. The trolleys I was organizing, the exact shade of blue of Grandma Barbara's dress, the smell of Grandpa Gerald's aftershave." Jennifer felt her own hands shaking. "Did you understand what happened that day?" "I understood more than they realized," Mason replied, finally meeting his mother's eyes. "I always understood. I just processed the information differently." A sad smile crossed Jennifer's face. Her son, whom many considered incapable of understanding complex emotions, had always understood everything: rejection, prejudice, fear of the different. "And now?" she asked. "Now," Mason replied, organizing his notes one last time, "I'm going to do what I've always done. Use my difference to make a difference." Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center stood imposingly against the Manhattan sky as the ambulance arrived, bringing Gerald Whitman. Mason watched through the window of his 12th floor office, his fingers drumming in a specific pattern on the mahogany desk. Beside him, 3 monitors displayed different aspects of the experimental treatment that could save his grandfather's life. Dr. Whitman and his assistant, Dr. Rachel Chun, entered the room. The patient and companion have arrived. They're being installed in room 1242. Mason adjusted his navy blue tie, making sure the knot was perfectly centered. "Thank you, Rachel. Please prepare the experimental protocol forms and schedule the preliminary exams for this afternoon." As he walked through the hospital corridors, Mason mentally went over every detail of the procedure. 20 years of research had brought him to this moment. The treatment he had developed combined gene therapy with targeted neural stimulation, a revolutionary approach that could not only slow down, but potentially reverse the degenerative process. He stopped in front of the door to room 1242, taking a deep breath. On the other side were the same people who had rejected him 2 decades ago. The sound of familiar voices came through the door. "Gerald, you need to calm down." Barbara's voice sounded tired. "This is the best treatment center in the country. Best center or not, I don't trust doctors who hide behind experimental protocols." Gerald's voice was weaker than Mason remembered, but it still carried the characteristic authoritative tone. Mason knocked 3 times on the door, always 3, before entering. The silence that followed was deafening. Barbara, still elegant at 75, but with a face marked by time and worry, was the first to react. "Mason," her voice faltered, her wide eyes fixed on the grandson she hadn't seen for 2 decades. Gerald, sitting on the hospital bed, looked like a frail version of the imposing man Mason remembered. His hair, once gray, was completely white, and his hands were visibly shaking, one of the most obvious symptoms of his condition. "Good morning," Mason replied, his voice professional and controlled. "I'm Dr. Mason Whitman, in charge of the experimental protocol you've been admitted to." Barbara put her hands to her mouth, while Gerald looked as if he had seen a ghost. You're the doctor?" Gerald managed to stammer out. "Yes," Mason replied, consulting the medical records. "Based on the preliminary exam sent from Rochester, we've developed a specific protocol for your case. We'll need to carry out some additional tests today." "Mason, honey," Barbara tried to approach, but Mason subtly backed away, keeping his professional distance. "I prefer to keep our interaction on a strictly professional level, Mrs. Whitman," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I believe it's more appropriate, considering the circumstances." Gerald tried to sit up straighter on the bed, his pride fighting against his physical frailty. "Did you know it was us when you took the case?" "Yes," Mason replied, making notes in the chart. "As I said earlier, I base my decision on clinical data, not personal issues." A heavy silence filled the room. Barbara began to cry silently, while Gerald seemed to be fighting an internal battle between his pride and his need for help. "Your mother," Barbara began, hesitantly. "Does Jennifer know we're here?" "Yes," Mason replied, still focused on his notes. "Actually, she's on her way. As director of the hospital psychology department, her presence is necessary for some aspects of the treatment." At that moment, as if it had been arranged, Jennifer entered the room. At 52, she radiated a confidence that contrasted sharply with the young single mother who had left Rochester 2 decades ago. "Mom, Dad," she greeted formally. "Mason, the lab results just came in." Mason nodded, taking the envelope she held out. His eyes quickly scanned the numbers and graphs, processing the information with his characteristic precision. "The markers indicate a faster progression than expected," he explained, turning to Gerald. "We'll need to start treatment immediately." "What if I refuse?" Gerald asked, his voice trembling slightly. Mason faced him directly for the first time. "Based on these results, without treatment, you have approximately 3 months to live. With treatment, there's a 68% chance of significant remission." Barbara sobbed audibly. Jennifer instinctively took a step towards her, but held back. "Why?" Gerald asked suddenly. Why did you agree to treat me? After all, Mason adjusted his glasses, a gesture that Jennifer recognized as a sign that he was processing an emotionally complex response. Because science doesn't discriminate, he finally replied. And because, contrary to what you believed, being different doesn't mean being less capable of compassion. The words hit Gerald and Barbara like a punch in the gut. 20 years of prejudice and regret seemed to weigh even heavier now, in the face of living evidence of how wrong they had been. The procedure is scheduled for tomorrow at 9 a.m. Mason continued, professionally. Rachel will be along shortly with the consent forms. I recommend you rest until then. As Mason turned to leave, Barbara called out, Mason, wait, please. He stopped, but didn't turn around. We were so foolish, she whispered. So terribly foolish. Mason remained still for a moment, his fingers drumming lightly against her thigh in their familiar pattern. Yes, you were, he replied simply before leaving the room. Jennifer watched her son walk away down the corridor, his white coat impeccable and his posture perfectly upright. She turned to her parents, seeing the weight of regret and belated understanding on their faces. He's extraordinary, Barbara murmured. He always was, Jennifer replied. You just couldn't see beyond your own limitations. The experimental procedure was scheduled to begin in 15 minutes, and Mason watched the monitors in the preparation room with his usual meticulous attention. Every piece of equipment had been checked 3 times, every drug checked and rechecked. On the gurney, Gerald Whitman looked smaller and more vulnerable than ever, dressed in the typical hospital gown. Mason, Jennifer gently touched her son's shoulder. The team is ready. He nodded, adjusting his lab coat for the 3rd time, a ritual that calmed him before important procedures. On the other side of the observation glass, Barbara watched anxiously, her hands clutching a handkerchief already damp with tears. Dr. Whitman, Rachel approached with the latest tests. The neurological markers are stable enough for us to start. Mason took the results, his eyes quickly scanning the numbers. Let's start the induction. Prepare 5 milligrams of... Wait, Gerald's weak voice interrupted. Mason, before we start, I need to say something. Silence overtook the room. The medical team stopped their preparations, and Jennifer instinctively stepped forward. Mason remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the monitors. I know I don't deserve your help, Gerald continued, his voice trembling. What I did was unforgivable. Mason finally turned to face him. Mr. Whitman, we don't need... No, please, Gerald insisted. I need to say this. I spent 20 years building walls of pride and prejudice, convincing myself that I was protecting our family, our reputation. But the truth is that I was only protecting my own ignorance. Barbara entered the room at this point, unable to continue just watching. Jennifer supported her as she staggered slightly. You were just a child, Gerald continued, tears streaming down his wrinkled face. A bright, special child who needed love and understanding. And I chose to see only what I didn't understand, what frightened me. Mason adjusted his glasses, a gesture his mother recognized as a sign of emotional discomfort. Mr. Whitman, your vital conditions are changing. We need to start the procedure. No, Gerald insisted. Not until you understand. Today, seeing the man you've become, the brilliant doctor who's about to try to save my life, I realized that the only one who was truly different was me. Different in the worst possible sense, unable to see beyond my own prejudices. Barbara sobbed audibly. Mason, your grandfather is right. We failed you terribly. And with Jennifer, our own daughter, Jennifer squeezed her mother's hand, decades of hurt and love conflicting in her heart. Mason remained silent for a few moments, his fingers drumming in their characteristic pattern against the clipboard he held. You know, he began, his voice controlled but charged with restrained emotion, that people with autism are often considered incapable of feeling empathy. A common misconception. In fact, many of us feel so deeply that we need to develop mechanisms to process these emotions differently. He paused, organizing his thoughts. For 20 years, I processed what happened in that office. Every word, every look, every rejection. And yes, it hurt, but it also motivated me. Every discovery I've made, every advance in my research, has been driven by the desire to prove that being different doesn't mean being less. Rachel discreetly checked the monitors, concerned about Gerald's vital signs, but didn't interrupt the moment. And now, Mason continued, I'm about to use everything I've learned to try and save your life. Not out of revenge or obligation, but because I chose to turn that rejection into something bigger than all of us. Gerald stretched out his trembling hand towards his grandson. Mason, will you forgive me? Mason looked at the outstretched hand, then at his mother, who nodded softly in support. After a moment's hesitation, he took his grandfather's hand. Forgiveness, he said, like love, manifests itself in different ways. Some express it with words, others with actions. I choose to express it through science, through the possibility of giving you a second chance. Barbara approached, her legs wobbly. We've wasted so much time. Yes, Mason agreed, gently releasing Gerald's hand. But now we need to concentrate on the present. Mr. Whitman, Grandpa, are you ready for us to begin? Gerald nodded, tears still streaming down his face. Jennifer hugged her mother as the medical team resumed their preparations. Rachel, Mason called out, his voice returning to its professional tone, prepare the induction. Let's get started. As the team moved with clinical precision, Mason allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The boy who organized carts into perfect patterns had transformed into the man who was now organizing molecules and genes to save lives. His differences, once seen as limitations, had become his greatest strength. Initiating procedure in 3, 2, 1, the sound of equipment filled the room, marking not only the start of an experimental treatment, but also, perhaps, the beginning of a new phase for the Whitman family. A phase where differences no longer divided, but united through understanding and the unconditional love that only time and wisdom can bring. The experimental procedure lasted 6 hours. Throughout, Mason remained absolutely focused, his precise and calculated movements guiding the team through the complex protocol he himself had developed. Jennifer and Barbara waited in the waiting room, the silence between them laden with 2 decades of unspoken words. The first results are promising, Rachel announced, as Gerald was transferred to the recovery ICU. The neurological markers have responded positively to the therapy. Mason removed his surgical mask, his eyes teary behind his glasses. The procedure had been technically perfect, but now the most challenging part began, waiting to see if the treatment would actually work. Dr. Whitman, one of the residents, approached with more test results. Tau protein levels have begun to stabilize. Keep constant monitoring, Mason instructed. I want to be notified of any changes, no matter how small. In the hallway, Jennifer watched her son through the glass of the doctor's room. He was sitting alone, methodically organizing his notes into specific patterns, a behavior that always helped him process emotionally intense situations. He still does that, Barbara commented softly, approaching Jennifer, organizing things into patterns. Yes, Jennifer replied. It's one of the many ways he's found to make sense of the world. One of the characteristics that you considered a problem turned out to be one of his greatest strengths in scientific research. Barbara wiped away a tear. How could we have been so blind, Jenny? How could we not see how special he was? You only saw what you wanted to see, Jennifer replied. The fear of what's different, the preoccupation with appearances. All this prevented you from seeing the real Mason. Inside the room, Mason continued his meticulous organization, his fingers moving with precision over the papers. Rachel entered with more test results. His vital signs are stable, she reported. And early indicators suggest that the treatment is working better than we expected. Mason nodded, absorbing the information. We'll need at least 48 hours to be sure. The next tests, he was interrupted by an alarm going off in the ICU. Within seconds, he was running down the corridor, followed by his team. Gerald was having an unexpected reaction to the treatment. Blood pressure dropping, a nurse announced. Administer 0.5 milligrams of epinephrine, Mason ordered, his voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. Rachel, prepare the emergency protocol we've developed. Barbara and Jennifer watched apprehensively as the medical team worked. Mason moved with surgical precision, every action calculated and executed to perfection. Mason has always known exactly what to do in moments of crisis, Jennifer commented, more to herself than to her mother. When others are paralyzed by panic, he finds clarity in precision. After 20 tense minutes, Gerald's vital signs began to stabilize. Mason personally checked every monitor, every medication, making sure everything was exactly as it should be. It was an expected reaction, he explained to the family. The treatment is aggressive, but necessary. The next few days will be critical. Barbara hesitantly approached Mason. You save his life today? Twice. It's too early for conclusions, Mason replied, adjusting his glasses. We need to wait. I'm not just talking about the procedure, Barbara interrupted gently. I'm talking about your choice to help us, even after everything. Mason was silent for a moment, his fingers drumming lightly against his thigh. You know, Grandma, one of the most fascinating things about the human brain is its ability to form new connections, even after years of established patterns. Neuroplasticity allows us to learn, to change, to evolve. Maybe people can too. Jennifer felt her heart squeeze as she watched her son, whom many considered incapable of expressing complex emotions, offer a profound lesson in forgiveness and change. The next 24 hours were crucial. Mason practically lived in the hospital, personally monitoring every aspect of his treatment. His attention to detail, which had once been seen as obsessive, was now Gerald's greatest hope. The next morning, the first definitive results began to arrive. Mason was in his office, checking the data for the third time, when Jennifer walked in. How are the results? She asked, knowing well the gleam in her son's eyes when he discovered something important. The treatment is working, Mason replied, his voice containing a restrained emotion. The neurological markers show a significant reduction in degeneration, and there are signs of tissue regeneration. Jennifer hugged her son, feeling him return the embrace in his own unique way. 3 gentle touches on the back, no more, no less. You did it, my love, she whispered. You really did it. Mason pulled away gently, turning his attention back to the monitors. There's still a lot of work ahead of us. The recovery will be long, and we'll need to adjust the protocol. Mason, Jennifer interrupted gently. It's okay to feel something other than scientific data. He paused for a moment, his hands resting on the keyboard. I feel it, Mom. I always have. I just process it differently. I know, darling, she smiled. I've always known. At that moment, Rachel rushed into the room. Dr. Whitman, your grandfather is awake, and he's asking for you. Mason was in his office at Memorial Sloan Kettering, reviewing the results of the last 6 months of Gerald's treatment. The graph showed a steady and significant improvement. The neurological degeneration had not only been halted, but showed clear signs of reversal. It was an unprecedented success in modern medicine. Dr. Whitman, Rachel knocked softly on the door. Your family is here for the final consultation? He nodded, methodically arranging his desk before getting up. In the hallway, he found Gerald walking unaided, Barbara at his side, and Jennifer smiling discreetly. The transformation was remarkable. His grandfather had regained not only his physical health, but also a vitality that he seemed to have lost a long time ago. Mason, Gerald greeted him, his voice firm and clear. Or should I say, Dr. Whitman? Mason's fine, he replied, leading them into the office. Please have a seat. We're going to go over the latest results. While Mason presented the data with his characteristic precision, Barbara observed the subtle changes in her grandson. He still retained his mannerisms, the way he lined up the papers, the rhythmic pattern of his gestures, but now there was a serene confidence in his movements. The results are extremely positive, Mason explained, adjusting his glasses. Targeted gene therapy has succeeded not only in stabilizing the condition, but in promoting significant regeneration of neural tissue. In layman's terms, Barbara asked softly. He's cured, Jennifer translated, smiling at her father. The treatment Mason developed worked better than anyone could have expected. Gerald sniffled, trying to control the emotion in his voice. Mason, these last 6 months haven't just been about my physical recovery. They've been a lesson in humility, unconditional love, and how wrong we were about so many things. Mason stopped his presentation, his fingers drumming lightly on the table in his familiar pattern. Neuroplasticity is not just limited to physical recovery, he commented. The human brain is capable of forming new connections, new understandings, at any age. Are you saying that old prejudiced people can learn new ways of thinking? Barbara asked with a sad smile. Science suggests so, Mason replied, allowing himself a small smile. And my personal experience seems to confirm that hypothesis. Jennifer watched the interaction with tears in her eyes. 20 years ago, in that office in Rochester, she could never have imagined this moment. Her brilliant son not only proving his worth, but also healing wounds far deeper than neurological ones. Mason, Gerald leaned forward in his chair. Barbara and I are selling the house in Rochester. We bought an apartment here in Manhattan. Mason raised his eyebrows, surprised by the information. Manhattan? We lost 20 years of our family's life because of our prejudice and ignorance, Barbara explained. We don't want to lose another moment. And Gerald added, we want to be around to see the impact your work will have on the world. The protocol you've developed. How many other families could it help? Mason turned to his monitors, where dozens of similar cases were awaiting analysis. The expanded clinical trials start next month. We already have over 200 patients pre-selected. 200 families who will get a second chance, Jennifer commented. Just like we had. Mason? Barbara stood up, hesitantly approaching her grandson. I know we can't erase the past, but would you allow us to be part of your future? Mason was silent for a moment, processing the question. His eyes met those of his mother, who nodded softly in support. You know, he began, one of the most interesting things about autism is how it allows us to see patterns that others don't notice. For years, I saw the pattern of rejection, of misunderstanding. But now I'm seeing a new pattern emerge. One of acceptance, of understanding, of love. Gerald and Barbara sobbed simultaneously, while Jennifer smiled through her tears. So, Mason continued, yes, you can be part of this new pattern. As long as you understand that being different doesn't mean being less. It just means being unique. Barbara couldn't help herself and hugged her grandson. To everyone's surprise, including his own, Mason didn't shy away. Instead, he returned the hug in his own way. 3 gentle touches on the back, precise and meaningful. I think that deserves a celebration, Jennifer suggested. How about family dinner tonight? The Italian restaurant on 87th Street, Mason added quickly. They have round tables for 6, adequate lighting, and the noise level is acceptable. Gerald laughed softly. Some things never change, do they? And they don't have to, Jennifer replied. That's exactly how it should be. As the family left the office, Mason stayed a moment longer, organizing his papers into perfect patterns. Rachel came in to drop off some more results. Dr. Whitman, she smiled, the new cases for the clinical trials have been approved. We can start scheduling the procedures. Mason nodded, a determined glint in his eyes. Good. Let's help other families find their own healing patterns. That evening, sitting at the round table in the Italian restaurant, watching his family gather, his mother laughing at an old story, his grandparents sharing glances of renewed love, and Rachel, whom he had invited to join them, Mason realized that he had discovered a fundamental truth. Sometimes the greatest scientific discoveries don't happen in laboratories, but in the hearts of people willing to learn, change, and love unconditionally. The boy who organized trolleys had become the man who not only organized molecules to cure diseases, but also helped reorganize hearts and minds to heal much older and deeper wounds. And therein, perhaps, lay the true miracle of science. Its ability to unite what was once broken, to create new patterns of understanding and acceptance, one brain, one heart, and one family at a time.